us for today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. And so we'll be starting the recording here and get going with the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the second part in our three-part webinar series on understanding and managing cyber risks. Cybercrime is expected to reach $2 trillion in corporate losses by 2019. The losses may be the result of simple mistakes that lead to data breaches. For example, an assistant who clicks on a link in a phishing email, a salesperson who leaves a smartphone in a coffee shop, or a board member who opens a malicious attachment sent via a spoofed email account. Without solid security education and training, everyone within the organization puts their company in jeopardy of a data breach and its potential fallout, which includes costly fines and often a reputation hit. My name is Dottie Schindlinger. I'm Vice President and Governance Technology Evangelist at Diligent Corporation. I'm very excited to be partnering with Jeff Welgan from CyberVista on this webinar series. In our first webinar of the series, we talked about threats and how companies can defend themselves against those threats. Before we move on to impacts, which we'll cover in our third and final session next week, we're going to talk about vulnerabilities. So today we'll be providing an overview of the multiple vulnerabilities facing organizations, how to identify high-level corporate data, how to define an organization's attack surface, and how to protect valuable corporate assets. If you missed our first session, we'll be sending playback links to this recording and our first discussion in a follow-up email after today. But before we get started, I'm going to give a brief recap of the work that Diligent and CyberVista each do, as well as provide a little background information about myself and Jeff. So very quick word about Diligent Corporation. We've been providing board portal technology for the last 16 years. We've helped over 4,700 companies and over 140,000 board members worldwide in making the transition to digital communication and collaboration solutions. I'm a recent member of the Diligent team. I was one of the founding team members at a company called BoardEffect, which has recently merged with Diligent. And so now, here at Diligent, I provide thought leadership on related topics through digital and print publications, conference presentations, and workshops for board members and executives globally. I'm also joined today by Jeff Welgan, Head of Executive Training Programs at CyberVista. CyberVista is a cybersecurity training and workforce development company. Jeff heads up the board and executive training programs, providing cyber literacy training for directors and executives. The program centers around managing and governing cyber risk as an enterprise risk issue. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to take the reins and kick us off on today's presentation on vulnerabilities. Jeff, thanks for joining us. And Jeff, we can't hear you.
Right. Well, thanks, Dottie. Thank you for hosting me today. I am having a little bit of technical difficulties on my end hearing any audio back, so just FYI for the audience and for you, Dottie, too. You can hit me in the chat window, and hopefully I'll see any questions that come up there. I'd actually really like to get started with a quick trivia question, just so that I know who all attended our first session last week on threats. It'll help provide me a little bit of more information of how much to recap from the threat section as we talk about vulnerabilities today. So if you don't mind, if you did attend last week's webinar on cyber risk focused on threats, please answer yes or no to this question. Just give you a few more seconds here. Okay, so it looks like about half and half here. We got nearly a 50-50 split between who attended last week versus who's attending today. For those of you who are back, thank you for coming back. This is, again, part of a series, and as you go through the series, you'll have a full and holistic understanding of what cyber risk is. So we're actually going to open up by starting on the whiteboard. So I'm just going to switch over here real quick, and we'll try to get me up on screen, and we can talk about a couple things. All right, great. So for those who attended last week, this might be a little bit of a review, but I had a couple statistics that I liked starting off with last time, and I'd like to just kind of recap those. The first one was 59%, 56% was the second one, 12%, and then we also talked about a number called 338 and 7.01. And just to kind of go through this real quick, 59% of directors find it very difficult and challenging to oversee and manage cyber risk. 56% of directors feel that they're not getting enough director education at their organizations. And then 12% of directors in the past year have participated in a test of their organization's cybersecurity response plans. 338, this is actually 338 days. If you joined us last time, we talked about the amount of time it takes for an attacker to, when they first get into your organization until that attack has been discovered, plus the time it takes from discovery to remediation is a total of 338 days. It's essentially from January 1st until December 5th. So that's a really long time for an attacker to be in an organization and into your systems to do whatever they may be doing in there. And then lastly, we talked about the cost of a data breach. And this is actually $7.01 million. It's the average cost of a data breach in the U.S. today. So just helps us keep things in context and perspective as we transition over to vulnerabilities. A couple other things that we talked about last time were some key themes for the whole webinar series. First thing was that cyber risk is an enterprise risk issue. We have moved and evolved from seeing cyber as its own silo of a risk category, and it impacts an entire enterprise. So because it impacts an entire enterprise, it should be managed as such. The second thing is that cyber is a people problem. Behind every cyber issue are people, whether that is a technology solution that you put in place or whether that are the policies and controls that you want to implement in your organization or the adversary who's coming after you. There's people behind each and every one of those. So at the end of the day, it's a people problem. And then the third thing is that cyber risk is measurable and manageable. So you can actually measure cyber risk over time and baseline your overall risk. Because you can track and measure it, you can then manage that. So you can put in policies and controls in place so that you can dial that risk down. So we talk about cyber risk, kind of going back to this first point, that cyber risk is an enterprise issue. So it impacts your traditional enterprise risk categories, whether that's a financial risk, whether that's operational, strategic, compliance, and sometimes physical. It acts as an influencer to each and every one of these traditional risk categories. So if it's an influencer to all of these traditional risk categories, what is cyber risk at large? Well, how do we define it? And at CyberVista, we define cyber risk as the product of three different coefficients. Your threats times your vulnerabilities times impacts. And last week we talked about threats. And threats is a reminder, and for those who are joining us for the first time during this webinar, threats are really the who and the why. It's the bad guys who are out there to come after you and the motivations behind why they're targeting you. A lot of times that's because you have data. And then vulnerabilities are essentially all of the internal factors that you have control over within your organization. So if you have the threats as bad guys, think about your vulnerabilities as the open, unlocked doors and windows that you have that pose a particular risk to your organization. We'll talk about that during today's webinar. And then next week we're going to talk about impacts. And essentially impacts is the result or the consequences of when threats and vulnerabilities come together. It's what happens when the bad guy opens that unlocked door or opens that unlocked window and walks in. And in that session next week, we're going to talk about some risk management techniques to dial down that risk to an appropriate level for your organization. So with that, this is the focus of our three-part series. We're going to just kind of transition back over to the slides here for a second, and then we'll go ahead and dive right into the content. Okay, so just this is a prettier version of what I had written on the board. So we'll just kind of skip ahead. Our program at CyberVista, so what we've done to aid the leadership is develop this cyber governance framework. And our framework and training program is really divided into three different parts here. Our Prepare unit focuses squarely on understanding cyber risk and setting leadership up for success. It's in essence what we're doing with this three-part series. It's focused on threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts. Then our Monitor unit centers on monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of any controls implemented across people, process, technology, and environment. We stress the importance of using a scorecard to measure cyber risk, as well as key policies that help to reduce your cyber risk profile. And then lastly, as we kind of go into that third unit called React, we really focus on leadership's role during a major cyber incident. And it's designed around managing enterprise risk during a crisis so that any organization can focus on the end game without too much disruption to its strategic goals and vision. So as part of this unit, we also like to integrate a cyber breach simulation into our live training program so leadership can kind of go through the test of how you respond during a major breach. So let's dive into some vulnerabilities. And we'll start off with a trivia question. So we'll open up the second trivia question, or second poll. And this one is about the percentage of unpatched vulnerabilities in websites. So what percentage of websites have unpatched vulnerabilities? I'll give you a moment to answer. Okay, great. So 44% of you guys said answer D, and answer D is correct. 75% of websites have unpatched vulnerabilities. That doesn't mean that all 75, every 3 out of 4 websites that you go to is harmful. It just means that there are potential unlocked doors and windows that could be exploited by an adversary or someone with malicious harm. So the point here is that the internet, the web, where you do your day-to-day business, where you're looking, there are risks out there, and they leave you vulnerable. All right, so we talk a lot about data, and in our first session we talked about the types of data that exist. What we want to do here is actually focus in on crown jewels. And when you think about crown jewels, I want you to think about the Britain's royal crown jewels. Right? If you have ever been to London and you visited the Tower of London to go actually see the crown jewels, you'll note a couple of different things. When you walk into the Tower of London and you're working your way towards that exhibit to look at the crown jewels, you actually go through multiple rooms, right? And those rooms have different locks and different security procedures in there to keep unwanted actors or thieves out and away from those crown jewels. The glass encasement that actually protects the crown jewels is a bomb-proof glass. It has a lot of sensors in there too. There are motion detectors in the Tower of London around the crown jewels. They also have included over 100 hidden CCTV cameras to keep an eye on everybody who's coming in there, what they're doing, see if there's anything suspicious. And in addition to all the surveillance that they're doing with and layered defense, they actually have physical security there too. There are 22 tower guards that are responsible for protecting those crown jewels. These are the guys who have the really bright red outfits and the funny hats. They're there to make sure those crown jewels are protected and anybody who is in there are protected. And then in addition to those tower guards, they actually have 38 yeoman warders, and these are ex-military personnel who actually live in the tower itself. So why does Britain take such great measures to protect those crown jewels? Well, it's because they are irreplaceable. If someone takes those, if something happens to them where they're damaged, it will be such a devastating event to Britain. And those crown jewels are so valuable. So you need to think about your organization that way too, right? Your crown jewels are the most important assets your company or organization has. They are essentially the lifeblood of your organization, and if they're lost or stolen, they will have devastating impact as well. And your crown jewels can come in a lot of different forms, right? It all depends on the business that you're operating. They can be customer data in some cases. It could be your intellectual property or your strategies. It can be source code if you're doing something in technology. Algorithms if you're doing a lot of trading or your trading platform. It can even be a recipe. If you think about Coca-Cola, One of their biggest crown jewels is that Coke recipe. It can have a devastating impact if someone else can replicate Coke. So the key point here is that these crown jewels ensure that you stay in business. And there's a difference in data, right? There's a difference between crown jewels and other data that have operational impacts to your organization. So one of the key things that you want to do in evaluating those crown jewels is, one, try to identify them. You want to identify all the digital assets and the supporting devices that, if they're compromised, could actually do significant harm and cripple your business. You also want to evaluate those crown jewels through the eyes of an adversary. What would they view as your crown jewels? They probably don't match up. In some cases they do, but it's important to know what each of the threat actor categories that we talked about last week, how they would view your data and what they think would be most valuable. And then you also want to consider what assets you have at your organization that are necessary for the future goals and operations of your business. Because a breach really can disrupt your business operations. It can also compromise your customer trust and result in even federal investigations or fines. That's why we talk about it as an enterprise risk influencer, not its own category. The second thing that you need to do is protect it. Right? You want to ensure that those key assets and any supporting physical devices that get to those assets are protected. So you need to know where your crown jewels are located, and then ensure that you have implemented strong security measures around those crown jewels.
Hey, Jeff, this is Dottie chiming in.
So I'm going to attempt to cover this on the whiteboard real quick. So, Dottie, I know you're talking, but I can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah. Are you able to hear me now?
Repeat the question for us. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So, so we do have a couple of questions. One of the questions that's come in is really focusing on what should the board's role be in helping to create a list of the company's crown jewels?
Okay, so board's role, responsibilities around creating those crown or identifying the list of crown jewels. Great question. So crown jewels will, if you ask different people in your organization at different levels, you might get a different answer on this. The board's role is one of the most important roles because they have such a strategic view of that organization. They understand enterprise risk as well. So they get, you know, what does this company need to perform and be successful, and what does this company need to do in the long term, because you have a strategic vision to stay successful, so over 5 or 10 years. So they have a really great strategic vision of what the organization is. And I would say the role of the board is also to kind of just act as a check and balance for what the executive team and functional managers below the executive team identify as crown jewels, right? The executive team, the CMO, and the CFO, and the CEO may come up with a little bit of different answers around, you know, what crown jewels exist. What they really should be doing, though, is compiling that list and then categorizing it, and then presenting that to the board so that the board can say, yeah, you're right, they can help with the prioritization part of the assessment, right? The board can look at it and say, yep, I see these 10 things. This is the order in which we should prioritize and protect those crown jewels so that we stay successful in the future. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, great. That's very, very helpful.
Okay. I'm getting a thumbs up here.
Yep, there is a follow-up question, and I'll try to keep it somewhat brief so that it can be repeated to you. But basically, the follow-up question is whether or not it's important to only identify what you would call crown jewels. And the context that this is being asked in is, if, for example, a healthcare system may be a victim of ransomware, and there was an incident where what they basically did was take over a neurosurgery patient scheduling database. And you wouldn't think that patient scheduling is a crown jewel, but it effectively shut down operations until they paid the ransom in Bitcoin. So I guess the question to ask would be, to what extent is it important only to find crown jewels, or is it really better to have a full threat assessment for the organization?
Okay, so you want to, what you want to do is you want to identify all of the different data sets that are types of data that you have that present some sort of damage or risk to your organization. Right? Crown jewels are the most important, and you need to prioritize the things that would really cripple your organization. That's why you need to prioritize your implementations around those crown jewels. But you don't want to leave the rest of the important data off from the assessment process because they can have significant operational impacts to your business too. Again, this is an influencer to all of your other enterprise risk categories. So just because you may have patient data or patient scheduling software, maybe that doesn't constitute a crown jewel for that organization. If you lose that system for a little bit of time, yes, it'll be an inconvenience to that hospital. It'll cause some operational impacts to that organization, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that organization will be completely shut down and go out of business, right? But it's a significant system, and there's significant data there that have operational impacts. So there really are two sets of data that you want to identify and categorize. Those really, really critical ones, crown jewels, and then all the other really important ones that also need protected and also need policies in place. It just helps you, when you identify the crown jewels, understand what's the most important so you know what resources to put in place around those data sets.
Great, thank you so much. It's a good answer to the question.
All right,
great.
Are there any other questions?
No, I think we're good for now. Keep going.
Okay, great. So we will switch over to the slides here again real quick. Okay, great. So, all right, great. Are you guys getting feedback right now? Yeah.
We are, yes.
Okay, hang on one second. How about now? Yes.
Seems like it's a bit better. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, actually, we're still getting feedback.
Just give me 1 second. Okay. How about now? Are we good?
That seems really good.
Great. You still see me on camera?
We can.
Okay. So what I want to do is talk about attack surface a little bit. And attack surface is a term, it's a cyber term that we use to describe all the avenues that an adversary has available to them to get into your organization. So when you think about attack surface, there are two different components to it. There are internal components, and actually I should call these layers, internal layers and external layers. On the internal side, there are three layers that you need to really pay attention to. One, and forgive my drawing, I'm not an artist, but there's a human layer, there is a network layer, and there's a software layer. And on the human side, these are things like your training programs that you have in place, the onboarding and HR processes and procedures, password policies, access control lists. On the network side, these are all the things that allow you to do communications through an organization. So this is Wi-Fi's, your routers, firewall. This includes your home networks as well, and public Wi-Fi networks if you're connecting to those. And then on the application or the software side, it's all of the operating systems and applications that you use on a day-to-day basis. So if you're using Microsoft Word products or Adobe products, etc., these are the layers that we're talking about here on the software side. So actually when you're looking at your main surface or your internal layers, you really should be asking a couple questions. One is, what strategies are in place to protect your human network and software surfaces? Are you using an acceptable cybersecurity framework? So many of you probably have heard of NIST, or ISO IEC 2700. You should have a cybersecurity framework in place to help manage that. And then what cybersecurity training programs do you have available at your organization to help reduce some of the risks associated with your internal layers of your attack surface? As we think about a business, we also know that our businesses are part of a, let me get a different pen here, an ecosystem, right? So if you think about your business, and this is your office building, I'm just drawing here, you're part of an ecosystem of business partnerships. So you have a lot of different third parties that you do business with. You also may engage in mergers and acquisitions as part of your business organization, especially as a director. You're heavily involved in any M&A activities. The other side of M&A is divestitures. Also part of your attack surface. And then lastly, you might have joint ventures that you engage in. And all of these different partnerships are with organizations. So if you think about your third parties, for example, how many organizations do you do business with on a regular basis? If not in the dozens, or you could be in the hundreds, right? These are even people that are coming into your office to take trash out. They're a third party who has access to your organization and potentially has access to sensitive information by being physically in the space. CyberVista, we use Google for Work. That is a third party that we host our sensitive information through Google Drive. You have to also remember that every single organization that fall under one of these categories has their own internal layers. Each one has a human, a network, and a software layer that they have to manage and deal with. So it's really important that when you're engaged in these kinds of relationships that you ensure that whoever you're doing business with holds a level of cybersecurity that is acceptable for your organization. They should have the same level of cybersecurity as you do require for yourself. And you really can think of this as a puzzle piece, right? This is a very dynamic and flexible surface. It expands and contracts with every single partnership. As you take on more third parties, that expands your attack surface. So your puzzle is getting larger. As you're going through the M&A deals, same kind of process here. So what do you do about it? Well, we'll start off with third parties. And I'll just cover a couple questions, but there are a lot of questions you should be asking in any of these activities as a director. But a couple to highlight here are around third parties, for example. You should ask, what are our third-party vendors doing to reduce or mitigate cyber risk? What kind of policies do they have in place? Do they store, and the other real question is, do they store or have access to any of your organization's key data? And how are they storing that data? Do they use another third party to store your data? Because remember, this is, you can kind of go down the degrees of separation here. Your third parties are also using third parties too. On the mergers and acquisition side, this is becoming a greater and greater area of concern for directors, if you especially look at what's going on with Yahoo and Verizon. Cybersecurity is coming to the forefront of that acquisition deal. So what should you be asking? You should ask whether or not the company you're acquiring or merging with have documented the policies and procedures that they have in place around cybersecurity. And how regularly are those policies reviewed, and how regularly do they practice a scenario when something bad happens? On the flip side, we talk about divestitures. And really, one of the key questions you want to be asking about with divestitures is that what policies are in place to make sure that your intellectual capital doesn't remain with the company you're divesting from? Do you have NDAs in place? Are you taking that data back? If they have access to certain systems and networks, have you retracted and reduced the access to those data sets and those networks? And then lastly, you should probably be asking whether or not all of the connection points have been shut down, and how do you ensure that they have been shut down? Too often during divestitures, there's still an open pipe or tunnel into the two companies. No one realizes that it's still there, but it provides an avenue through which an adversary can still access your organization long after you've divested. So that's a problem. And then on joint ventures, a lot of the same kind of questions you would ask with the other categories, but one that really comes to mind for me is around foreign joint ventures. And when you're conducting a JV with another foreign entity, maybe you're doing it in China or elsewhere in the world, Brazil, how do you ensure proper due diligence is being conducted, particularly around any political ties or partnerships that organization has within their country of residence? So it's a big issue with China and Chinese joint ventures. A lot of those companies are actually state-owned entities and have ties back to the Chinese government. And we know that China is very interested in certain types of IP and information, so it poses an additional layer of risk for any organizations who are doing business with a joint venture based out of China. So you should be keeping these things in the back of your head. All right, with that, we'll switch back over to the slides.
So Jeff, this is Dottie again. We do have a question when you're ready.
Okay, so this is just a pretty version of the thing I just drew on the board. Okay, and then we'll open up with another trivia question here real quick. So we'll open up poll. What percentage of phishing messages were opened by the recipient back in 2015? Okay, so percentage of phishing messages, the answer is actually B, 30%. 30% of phishing attacks were opened by the recipient. It's significant. 1 in 3 essentially get through to the organization.
Matt, if you're able, are you able to hear me?
Next trivia question.
I'm sorry.
Of employees steal critical proprietary. Yes, go ahead.
So we can go ahead and open up this poll if you like first, and then we can come back. But we did have a question about, you know, sort of a follow-up question on the attack surface. So let me know when you're ready to answer that question.
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure. So the question was thinking in terms of the human component of the attack surface. You were mentioning third parties and other kinds of entities that might be part of that surface. The question was about boards, particularly board members that are outside directors or external board members. The question was, what should the company or the organization be doing to ensure that board members are not inadvertently increasing the level of risk by having access to sensitive information outside the IT security infrastructure?
That's a really great question. And yeah, so board members clearly are part of the human layer that we talked about earlier, right? And they have access to all kinds of sensitive data. And I think with board members in particular, the greatest risk comes around how that information is being communicated. Are they using mechanisms to communicate that are approved by their organization and are protected, right? So ensuring that they're not using their personal email addresses to pass back and forth sensitive data. Making sure that they're not storing those files that may have your 5-year strategy or your investment plan on their local machines that aren't protected by the company's infrastructure. And then, you know, I think what Diligent has in place around communicating and sharing those files is a really great way to protect really sensitive data like that.
Great, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and open up the next poll now.
Okay, great. So this one also kind of goes back to the human layer. What percent of employees steal critical proprietary data and information when they quit or are fired? I'll give you another second. Okay, so 44% of you said 59%. And answer B is the correct answer. 59% of employees, when they leave an organization, take sensitive information with them. They pose a great risk to any organization. So, kind of to that point, your people are your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability. And one thing I want to talk about with this particular slide is around social engineering. Social engineering takes advantage of your employees' inherent and trusting nature, and it comes in many forms. It can come in person, it can come over the phone, through social media, etc. But 30% of all cybersecurity incidents are the result of social engineering efforts via email. And these efforts are broadly known as what's called phishing attacks. And in general, there are 3 different types of phishing attacks. One is just the generic term, phishing. And this is when communications come from an attacker that are disguised as some sort of legitimate source. A layer above from that is what's called spear phishing. And these are phishing attempts that are directed at specific individuals or companies. So they tailor their message even further to make it seem like they're applicable to you as an individual. And then the next layer is what's called whaling. And we're seeing more and more whaling phishing attempts. And these are phishing attacks that are targeted towards senior executives. So really important for directors to know this, for your C-suite executives to know that there are an increased amount of attempts to target them via email. And this is done because those executives and senior level directors have a different set of information, right? They have usually more access to things across a company. They have really sensitive information around their strategies and plans. They're a funnel. All the information funnels up to them. Sensitive information that's being passed over to outside counsel. This is all really valuable to threat actors. And what we're seeing here with phishing is that the attacks are becoming more sophisticated. And while most phishing activities are done by criminals, as you can see on the slide here, nearly 10% of phishing activities are conducted by nation states. And in our last session, we talked about the amount of resources and sophistication that nation-state cyber actors have. It's not a good scenario when 10% could be targeting you. So what do? You really want to establish a cyber-aware culture that will help defend your organization against social engineering and create a resilient workforce. And there are 5 A's of cyber resiliency for culture. The first one's advocacy. You really want to enthusiastically support and advocate your cybersecurity strategy and objectives. The second A is always. You want to always require leadership to continuously invest in consistent cyber awareness training. As you can see on the stats here on the slide, only 46% of companies require cyber training. And then of that, 29% of CEOs and C-level executives are exempt from that training, which implies that nearly 70% of all executives do not receive a form of cyber training. So this is problematic when we're seeing an increase in whaling attempts to get information that's really sensitive, but a big gap in that training for the same audience. The third A is awareness. You want to increase employee awareness through training and establishment of procedures and policies. The next is accountability. You really want to emphasize responsibility at the individual level and discourage the idea that cybersecurity is someone else's problem. Everybody has to be accountable. And then lastly, all hands on deck. You want to cultivate an organizational culture that emphasizes risk mitigation as a shared endeavor. And once you can start changing behaviors and moving towards cultural changes around cybersecurity, you really can then become more and more resilient and more protected at large. So what do we do about this? Really, the goal is to prevent this perfect storm. And that's when exploitable opportunities and desirable targets come together. That is the perfect storm that you need to avoid. So you need to understand your attack surface and how executive decisions that you may make could increase your potential risk.
We talked about the software, network, and human part. That's all part of this, along with those business partnerships. Remember that the attack surface extends far beyond the scope of IT. It really is an executive management responsibility. The other thing you want to do is around this desirable targets. Identify your crown jewels. Ensure that security investments are focused on the potential risks that would most impact your organization. These risks include losses of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data. And you need to prioritize those most critical assets. And in some ways, it's impossible for the board to do the real work in this category of focus, because this is where governance and oversight is. But this is where governance and oversight is so critical. This is also the area where some of the more technical aspects begin to emerge and more important in managing that cyber risk. So, as a board, you must require a serious cybersecurity framework for managing the risk profile and focusing on that attack surface. Also insist that management get outside counsel on cyber. And they must assure that there is an independent process for monitoring cyber risks.
Hey, Jeff, this is Dottie. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, so we have a question that came in that isn't 100%. Yep, it isn't 100% related to what you just said, but it's related enough that I think this is a good time to ask it. The question that came in was, what sort of advice might you provide to companies that are concerned that their board members and directors are just not tech savvy enough to be able to handle all of the cybersecurity monitoring and risk mitigation? What kind of guidance do you give to companies where they just, they're concerned that their board members are just not savvy enough to handle this stuff?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And actually, I could have a very long answer to this, but I know we don't have time. We're seeing a couple different things in the boardrooms, right? We are seeing boards appoint a cybersecurity expert to sit on the board and have a seat. And I think this is a good first step to address that savviness. However, it also provides an opportunity to scapegoat that issue to that one person. And I think that's a risky move. This is why we advocate for literacy, right? We don't expect boards and directors to become technical experts. The role of a board, the role of a director is really to be in that oversight and the governance role. And directors are really good at sensing BS. And what we want to do around this issue is arm them with enough literacy around the topic so that their BS meter goes off when appropriate. And when you start getting that meter start flashing, you should be asking more and more questions. So it's really about understanding the general concepts and asking the right questions. And then if you're not hearing the right answers, asking more questions. The problem, though, is that oftentimes a director will ask a question and it kind of ends there, right? They ask it, they get a response, and then the eyes glaze over on the response. So no follow-up questions are being asked, which also presents another problem too for whoever's communicating to you. The other problem with this issue is that typically you're getting updates either from your CISO or the CIO, and unfortunately many CISOs especially, they don't do a very good job translating cyber tech speak into board speak. So it's a much bigger issue that needs to be addressed, but cybersecurity starts at the top, and you can really make a lot of progress just by having some general awareness, some general literacy, and being armed with the right questions.
That's great. That's really helpful, Jeff. And I think there's sort of a follow-up question here. It's sort of a part two of the same question, which I think is worth asking. And that was sort of in the context of maintaining security of director interactions and communications, so maintaining security of director information. What sort of guidance would you provide to a company if the directors that they're working with are maybe a bit older, maybe not very tech savvy, and struggle to remember complex passwords or just refuse to use the company issued devices? If the directors won't adhere to the policies that the company sets in place, what do you recommend that companies do?
well, it's really hard to hold the directors accountable for that. But I think where you get most value in an issue like that is finding a solution that's simple enough for them to use. Simplicity is such a great thing when it comes to cybersecurity. Oftentimes we have very technical and complex systems that we use in our day-to-day workforce, but wherever you can strip out those complexities and replace it with something simple that doesn't seem to interfere with the day-to-day normal operations that directors are used to, I think that's critical. But we do know that more and more directors are actually fairly tech-savvy. The iPad is a really big operating system and tool that many directors use. And I know Diligent has a great app to help communicate and pass along some of that sensitive data that's pretty seamless. So I think finding solutions like that and implementing them are really great investments, because it keeps directors using something safe, and it avoids this whole, like, I'm just going to go do it through my own Gmail account.
That's great, thank you. And then maybe just one last question, and I think we can go through the rest of the slides here, but the final question on that same point was, you mentioned how important it is for the board to stay on top of the, kind of the ongoing cybersecurity program. So are there specific, KPIs or benchmarks or specific metrics that the board should be asking for?
Yes. There's a very long answer to that.
And the list is?
Yeah, this is actually what we cover in our second unit in our training programs, Monitor. It's called Monitor Unit. And that's focuses on two different things. One, measuring your risk. So putting a dashboard or a scorecard in place to understand what your overall risk level is and where you want to be is really important. And then the other piece is the policies and controls that you need to put in place across people, process, technology, and environment that help directors dial down the risk as to a threshold that's appropriate for their organization. Right? You can't get rid of all cybersecurity risk. If you don't have any risks related to cybersecurity, you don't have a business. So really it's all about determining what the threshold is so you can prioritize those policies and controls across those 4 different areas.
Great, thank you so much.
So this last slide here is really about the board's role. And these are some more questions that you can use to ask through your organization to drive them to a more resilient posture. First question, what assets, if compromised, would significantly harm our business operations and future goals? This is where we're talking about prioritizing those crown jewels and identifying other data sets that would have operational impact. What assets and data would our adversaries and competitors consider valuable? You need to understand and identify your crown jewels, including any assets that seem inconsequential to you but may hold value to other threat actors. Third question here is, where are our crown jewels located, and what security measures are in place to protect them? You need to understand any reporting requirements and mechanisms in the event those crown jewels were compromised. And you should also maintain a list of authorized users who have access to crown jewels and ensure that that list is regularly evaluated and updated. You want that list to be as small as possible without impacting your business operations and communications. What are the cyber risks to which our business partners expose us? Remember, you're part of an ecosystem. So you need to understand and measure your attack surface. And then identify the cyber risks that your network infrastructure, business partners, acquisitions vendors, and other third-party service providers introduce. And then do our business partners conduct regular vulnerability assessments and testing? You need to make sure that they are implementing policies and procedures that you would require on your own organization. If they're not doing regular assessments on their networks and their data, that should be a red flag that goes off to you. And on the technology side, you really need to evaluate your strategy on a regular basis. You should have an executive team look for ways to reduce redundancies in technology solutions, because oftentimes technology products are designed to protect and defend networks. They package additional features in their products, but those features often don't get fully utilized. This results in a patchwork of solutions that aren't being used. You should also look for solutions that require a 20% investment that yields an 80% return. You can spend a lot of money around technology, but you really want to look for what's most valuable and what's going to protect your information. You also should make sure third parties use software and technology that integrates well with your organization and aligns with your cybersecurity strategy. And again, have your executive teams regularly evaluate access control policies and lists. So where do you go from here? Well, when it comes to cybersecurity, everyone has a responsibility. The first step to success is literacy. CyberVista's Cyber Resolve program allows for a structured approach to cyber risk management and covers over 25 cyber-related topic areas. We also offer that breach simulation exercise so you can put your skill sets to the test. And on May 1st, we're hosting a day-long seminar in New York City at the Times Square West End. So join us there to learn more. You can use the promo code DILIGENT, and we will give you $500 off the registration fee. We can also bring the learning to you and your organization, though, through customized private training events. So we can come to you, talk to you about what's most concerning to your organization, and do some training with you around that. It's a little bit more bespoke and customized. So if you're seeking a more intimate experience, please feel free to give me a call, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about those solutions. And then, Dottie, I'll turn it over to you on the secure collaboration piece.
Great, thank you, Jeff, and we'll wrap up here in just a moment, but before we do have a couple of final questions that have come in. And so for those of you that are still on the phone, if you have other questions, keep sending them in through the question box or the chat box, just like we talked about at the beginning. Be happy to pose the questions to Jeff. So the questions that just came in, Jeff, are more around, doing any type of security testing or auditing with the board. So the specific question was, do you ever recommend organizations doing some type of a tabletop exercise or some type of a cybersecurity drill with the board to see how they respond and what areas of education might be required?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it kind of goes to what we do in our React unit. Actually, in our prepare unit, or I'm sorry, in our monitor unit, we talk about what kinds of plans you need to put in place under processes. Incident response plans and business continuity plans are really key to getting through a cybersecurity crisis. And actually, implementing a business continuity plan can reduce the average cost of a breach by about, I think it's like $7 per data record lost. So it's really important to test and practice those scenarios with your board and executive team, because when you put policies and procedures in place, you don't know if they're actually going to work well until they're tested. So the executive team should test those out, go through a simulation or a tabletop exercise. Then you can take any kinks that you see, whether it's in the policy or how you communicate, and turn those lessons learned back into the policy. And then the board should be included, because some of the information will be, it'll be necessary to get the board involved. So you need to understand how the board responds to those solutions. Getting pressures from shareholders, external shareholders, oftentimes happens with directors. What's the policy for communicating across the board and down through the executive team so that there's not a communication spillage? Understanding how your PR firms and your external communications plans is also key to this too. So by going through a tabletop exercise or a simulation, you get to see how an event plays out, not just in your own organization, but as you kind of go through the external communications and PR and some of those strategic risk areas that you may face.
That's great. That's helpful. And just to kind of piggyback on that for a moment, we also had some more specific questions around boards communicating with one another, so just director communications and sort of the security of that, and I think it would sort of follow up from the previous questions. And the question really was about, is there some recommendation around performing any type of a security audit of the way the board communicates, and or having a separate policy around, managing board communications in a secure fashion?
Yeah, I think every organization needs to look at what works best for them. And as we mentioned earlier, right, as you move up through an organization, you tend to have more access to information, so you want to develop a policy around how that's being shared. And as a director, you're probably sitting on some other boards too. So as an organization, you want to make sure that your directors aren't mixing pieces of information from other organizations, right? If something gets compromised, you want to make sure that it's at least contained through the organization that was compromised. You want to make sure that the threat actors aren't getting extra information from companies B, C, D, and E. So yeah, develop a policy around that, and do some auditing around that. It's always good to test it. If you don't know there's a problem, if you just want to ignore it, you're just adding more fuel to the fire.
Great, thank you. And we're getting close to wrapping up here, and so just to quickly sum up, one other thing that we might suggest or recommend to people if they have an interest in learning a bit more about securing board communications, that is work that Diligent does quite a lot of. There's a number of different resources that we have available. We'll be sending some links to some follow-up information after this webinar. But also, just to mention a couple of specific things, we have a platform that Jeff mentioned earlier that is focused on sharing information for board meetings and helping to coordinate all the information and documents that boards regularly review as they're preparing to do their work. And then in addition, we now also have a new feature called Messenger, which is a closed-loop communication system for boards that works very similar to text and email, but it's completely closed-loop and integrated into the Messenger platform, so that, or excuse me, into the board's platform, so that there's really no risk of potentially sending something to the wrong person who's not even a part of the board. So it's more of a closed-loop system, totally secured. So if that's of interest to people, we'd love to talk with you. We will be sending out links to the recording from today, as well as the handouts from today, including the slide deck that you've been watching. And we invite you to get to know a little bit more about Diligent if you don't already know about us. Also, please get to know a bit more about CyberVista. I think as you can tell from Jeff's presentation, they offer just absolutely terrific services and can certainly help your executives and your board become much more sophisticated on cybersecurity and cyber risk management. And certainly we'd be happy to come and do some training and some coaching with your executives and your board. Well, that brings us right up to the edge of our time together today. So I just want to take a moment and say thank you so much to Jeff Welgan. Jeff, this was another terrific presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. We will be finishing up this three-part series next week, and I believe it is the same day of the week, same time. So we're going to be doing Thursday again at 2 p.m. Eastern. So we would like to ask you to consider coming to that final session. Jeff will be presenting the final bit of information around managing this complex process. And once again, if you have questions, please, by all means, feel free to send them either to Jeff or to us, and we'll be happy to get back with answers very quickly. Thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful day.